What's up, everyone? This is Ryan here, and you are watching episode 28 of my live stream Q&A. So, let's get started. So before we get to anything else, I would just like to thank the following people for supporting me on Patreon. So that's going to be Seth Keegan, Trevor Halvorsen, Bassam Helal, Tina Fredericks, Nanotech, Shadow, Mr. Bidwell, Graham Hertzeg, Sushil Chanda, and Elad Stavi. So to those people, I thank you very much for supporting me, and I would also like to mention, and this is our only commercial for the day, well, I do run the odd commercial, but anyways, if you like what I do and maybe I've helped you out or something like that, then please do consider supporting me either on Patreon, or you can also pick up my introductory Android ebook, which is available down in the description box down below under the wiseassblog/products link down there. And yeah, so that's our commercial for the day. And I don't have too many announcements. My only announcement for today is basically that I will be starting work on my Android REST tutorial, and that will also make up the sort of lesson/discussion that I'll be having before we get to the Q&A stuff for today. So that's pretty much it, and I think we're just going to kind of dive in. But let's see, do we have anyone on the stream already? Got a whole 3 people. Awesome. Well, you 3 people are going to get a little lesson in RxJava 2 specifically. So what I wanted to talk about today was, let's see here. One moment. Okay, let's get started. So the discussion for today is I wanted to kind of do almost a rehash, not a rehash, but just kind of discuss something which I actually learned about from 2 people. Let me just pull up my notes page and then I'll write out the details here for you. All right, so that's going to be boom. So I talked about this briefly in a previous episode, but I just want to mention these 2. There's a blog written by Dan Liu, and you can search in the Google error handling RxJava Dan Liu, and you should be able to find it. Then there's also a talk on YouTube. Jake actually has 2 talks on RxJava, but specifically this is the one that I'm kind of referencing. And what I'll be talking about today is my experimentation in essentially using reactive streams and sort of static view models and things of that nature to sort of manage the application state. And also this will kind of be going over RxJava 2 operators and stuff like that. Just RxJava 2 flow. Essentially what I wanted to do is take you through sort of what's going to happen with a particular application and how the RxJava stuff kind of directs the flow of things. So before I proceed, I do want to mention, if you're not familiar with RxJava, I will try and explain it simply. So do give it a shot if RxJava is something new to you and you're not really comfortable with it. I'll try and kind of go line by line through one particular use case of the application, and we'll see if we can kind of make some sense of what's going on. So without further ado, let's get started here. By the way, I do apologize about the lighting. It's like 8 a.m. here in Canada in nearly winter, so the sun has kind of just come up. All right, so yeah, and just one last time, I would suggest you check out these 2 articles. So let's get started here. So the repository we're going to be looking at is called Android REST Tutorial, and it's available. Sorry, that glare is bugging the crap out of me. Just give me one moment here. Just a little too bright for me. There we go. Okay. So the repository we'll be looking at is Android REST Tutorial. It is just down below in the description box on GitHub. And let's just kind of get started here. I was fiddling around a little, so what we're going to do is we're going to start in the view and kind of see how the whole event sort of propagates to the rest of the application. And just before that, I just want to demonstrate what's going to happen really quickly. So go away, stupid application. Okay, so just really quickly, this is how the application works, all it does. So when you bring up main activity, I know that's super dark, it's a dark theme. I can change the brightness, how about? There we go. So it's just an input box with a submit button. I'll just explain because it's hard to see. So you can type in the name of a user on GitHub, and what the REST API will do is it'll send that request to GitHub and then get a list of public repositories of that given user. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to type in my name, my GitHub name, bracket Cove. I'm going to hit the submit button, and it should parse a list of repositories unless my internet connection is being stupid. There we go. And I know it's hard to see, but basically all it's showing you is just a list of my public repositories and a list of my, that's just my user profile on GitHub. So that's all the application does, and that's all it's really intended to demonstrate, is just a really basic sort of REST parser application, or REST browser or whatever. So what we're going to do is, let's get started. So pretty much the entire use case of this application is if I go to main activity. So this is where the application starts, and this of course has the input box and the submit button. And so yeah, basically what happens is the user is going to plug that in, and then in the submit button's on click, it's going to start a new activity, and it's going to pass that username in as a bundle. All right, so hopefully everyone's clear on that. What I can do also is, as I'm going, oh, the sound is too low? Are you guys sure? Because I hear varying reports on the sound, and all right, I'll turn it up a little. Apparently the sound is a little bit low, so let me just... I hear varying reports on this. Oh, I better do that off camera there. Levels. All right, I'll bump it up 5 decibels, or 20 apparently, because that's what it's going to force me to do. And so that should be louder. Hopefully that's better. I do apologize about that, but also at the same time, like, I hear... yeah, anyways, let's move on. So if you kind of... What I would like is, if anyone has any questions, take note of them now. What I'll do is I'm going to take you through this application flow. Then I'll open up questions about what I was talking about, and then we'll just get into the general Q&A. But so if you have any questions, or you kind of want to know, like, okay, we got to this part and I don't know what that is, you can go ahead and take note of where I am in the code, and I can come back and take you through it again or whatever. So let's get started here. So the user enters a username, and they hit the submit button, and then it fires this activity, list activity, and it passes the username as a string. Just a quick tip, if you want to quickly close tabs, you can hold shift and just click on the tabs up here, and they go away. And so then we'll go into repo list, which is the next thing. So this is the next thing that's going to happen, is we're going to fire list activity. So basically what list activity does, and I do need to make a quick note, I don't normally use activities as views, but that was kind of a deliberate sort of simplification. But yeah, so we have our activity, and it gets our bundle passed in. And essentially what happens is we have a presenter which is injected. I'm not going to talk about Dagger 2 dependency injection, but this thing gets given a presenter. And I do actually use the Android injector classes to manage this dependency injection, so that's just one sort of small point. But Android injection here, as you can see, that's a new Dagger 2 thing. I just said I wasn't going to talk about Dagger 2, and I'm talking about Dagger 2. I apologize. Anyways, so what's going to happen is we're going to hit, where is it? Start main activity. No, that's not the one at all. So just one little note here. If the extras are null, we just start main activity, because obviously we can't execute the thing if that's null. Yeah, so we get our user object in, and we've got our presenter. And so essentially, we don't actually call anything directly on the presenter as far as, or no, sorry, we call, in the onStart method, we're going to call to the presenter, hey presenter, start up and take the username we entered in the previous activity. Let's jump into list presenter. So what I hope I'm doing here is I'm kind of demonstrating to you that you can sort of go through your code and there's sort of a flow to it. So this is where things get kind of interesting. So within our presenter, again, we're using a dependency injection. So I pass in the view, which is the activity, and I just need to double check that I'm not leaking that and stuff like that. This is not a final sample, but we pass in the view as the activity as the view interface. We have a repository data source interface, so that's essentially where we're going to be getting the data from. And then we have a scheduler provider, which is for RxJava2 magic. And of course, a composite disposable. The disposable, essentially what that allows you to do is you can add these sort of RxJava2 subscriptions to it. And then when onStop is called, sort of say in the activity or something like that, you can clear them. Now, I would actually like to do this probably with, I even have it implemented here, you can see. I'd like to probably do that with, what's it called, Lifecycle Observer and all that. Anyways, let's get to the RxJava stuff, because this is really what I wanted to talk about. So the first thing that's going on here, which might seem a little weird, I'll zoom in a little. If you've never seen RxJava before, if you've never really wrapped your head around RxJava, when you see this kind of stuff, you can tend to get freaked out. Like, most people if they've used RxJava a little bit, they're pretty clear on what this is. This thing is kind of like a listener. This is like a callback. So we know that at some point, hopefully, we're going to get a callback in this subscribe with method here for our subscriber. And at some point, we're going to get some data, or we might get errors, or we might get onComplete. And so these are the three primary callbacks for the flowable or observable RxJava interface. So that's fine and dandy. Most people don't have a big issue about this. This is basically where our data will end up after the operations have executed. So hopefully that's fairly straightforward for everyone. Where things get a little different is with these operators like start with, on air, return, and things like that. But I will get to that. But what we're going to do is I'm going to take you through almost line by line as if I'm a friggin' debugger tool, stepper, and we're going to see what happens here. So the first thing I want to point out is this disposables object is basically designed to accept I believe, so I'm horrible with jargon terminology, but it's designed to accept a disposable, and a disposable is kind of, if I'm not mistaken, please correct me if I screw this up, I'm vaguely right. A disposable is a kind of subscription. So the thing about RxJava 2 is that you have observables. So an observable is some kind of data or data stream that you wish to observe, and you're ready to accept the output that it emits. And then you have observers, which are the things that watch the observables. Now, when they wire up to each other, that's called a subscription. I think it's also called a, what was the other term? For a flowable, it's a subscription. It's a I don't know. There's a whole bunch of jargon names and I forget them, but just bear with me on there. So this subscription is sort of a merriment, a marriage of an observer and an observable. and then we can kind of add that subscription to a list of disposables. So that's what's going on here. This composite disposable object gets kind of given our subscription, holds on to it, and then when we need to, we can break down the stream. So I'm going to keep this very simple, very surface level here. So what all I tried to explain there is this is what's going on here. This is a mechanism with which we can kind of keep track of our observable streams, is how I would kind of put it in plain English. The next thing I want to talk about is we have this method here, dataSource.getUserRepository. And you're probably noticing, okay, so we're calling a method on an object here, an interface to be specific, and then we're allowed to use RxJava based on a response from passing in our user ID to this data source. So naturally, this must only be possible if our data source interface returns a flowable. So if I open up, I'm going to go to Data, Repository Data Source Interface, and as we can see here, this method, getUserRepositories, does indeed return a flowable of type ListViewModel. We'll get to the ListViewModel stuff. So this is the method we're calling right off the bat. So this observe-on operator, what this essentially does is we're saying we want to watch for the response, or we want to sort of listen in, we want to handle this code on the main thread, essentially, what gets called back. And notice we don't actually say subscribe on in this part of the observable stream, or chain, or whatever the technical word is for it. Okay, so what we're saying here is data source, get me user repositories for this username, and I'll be listening to you on the UI scheduler. So we're going to kind of jump around a little bit. First, I'm going to hop into the data source implementation. So this is the class under the interface, the class that the interface implements. And of course, we have our getUserRepositories method. And so here's our next thing. So once again, we're going to be returning a method from another class. This is a repository. So I initially learned of this as the facade pattern, but it's also commonly called the repository pattern. Now, just an unfortunate thing here that you need to be aware of. This application works on GitHub repositories as an object, as our data model, and this is the repository pattern. So there is a repetition there. Those are separate concepts. I do apologize, but it just happens that our app works with repositories. So what I mean by that very specifically is if I open up data model, you'll see there's a repository data model, which is just the data I would like to represent in the user interface, as you can see here. Anyways, let's move on. So we're going to call this class. Now, as you've probably assumed, yes, this will have to return a flowable or observable of some kind as well. So if I hop into REST adapter, which is here, what you're going to see is that I've configured my retrofit to return a flowable of type response, list, repository data model. That's quite a mouthful there. But essentially what this says is I want to return a list of repositories, and we're going to wrap that in a response object. We'll talk about that later. But most importantly, a flowable. I want to make an observable out of what retrofit returns to me. So this GitHub REST adapter is very simple. It just returns our call to our GitHub adapter. And we don't really need to even think about that. So at this point, what's going to happen is let's kind of pretend we are the debugger. Okay, we've gotten to here. We call this method, and then we get some kind of response. Or, you know, things are just kind of in flight is a better way of talking about it. We've set up our data stream, and we're ready to start listening for that response by our retrofit adapter. So the next thing I want to bring your attention to is where is repository data source interface? So we've got that going. We call that on our REST adapter, and that result is going to get flat mapped, which is an RxJava operator. So what this operator means is I'm basically saying, hey, I know this thing here is going to return a flowable of type this huge thing, response list repository data model. I want to turn this in to a list view model. And the reason why I want to do that is because I don't necessarily, in general, it's usually a good idea to have a different model. And when I say model, I'm in this case not speaking of a layer of architecture. I'm more speaking of a specific class, a data model or a POJO. As a general principle, you'll often find that it's good to have different kinds of data models for different layers. I know that's confusing as hell, maybe, but what I'm trying to do with this flat map is, where do I have that? This is just going to be an. Actually, no, I won't do that. But basically, what we're trying to do here is we get an input of one type, maybe an input of type water glass, and I want to take the contents, or I want to turn this water glass into a cup of coffee. That's a horrible example, but that's what's going on here. So when our REST adapter returns this, executes this method and returns the flowable, it's going to emit the data. It's going to emit this response of list of repository data models. That's going to pop into our parameters here, and then we're just going to map that response into a list of repository list items, which then, how does this work? So we're doing the data model. Yeah, we'll get to this part next, but we're going to sort of map our list of these things, our data models here, into sort of a list of more view applicable data models. Because the thing about our sort of back-end data model is that it has sort of, you can fix this using, I forget what they're called, but annotations. What are they called? Something keys? String keys? I don't know. I forget the friggin' name, but you can map from, this is the actual returned name from our JSON data from the retrofit response, whereas you can map this to more good-looking Java variable names, but essentially that happens here. So we create this list out of our list that gets passed in, and then we emit a flowable. Now this is the next part of this talk, and this part gets kind of interesting. So this is where the Jake Wharton UI model thing, if you watch his presentation, which I mentioned earlier, it's called Managing State Using RxJava, I believe. On YouTube, you can find it. He talked about using, he talked about managing essentially every normal flow of an application in one observable stream. One particular sort of use case in one stream, I might say, or actually I think he wanted to do an entire feature in one observable stream, but whatever, I'm rambling. Here, let me just get to the code. Here's what's going to go on here. We've got our presenter, and it's going to ask our repository to get the data. Now, the repository object, the presenter shouldn't worry about what the repository does. It shouldn't know a lot about the repository. It shouldn't care that it's using retrofit. But what should happen is that whatever the repository sends back into the presenter, which gets rendered into the view, whatever goes in there, we want to basically represent any potential thing other than absolutely fatal errors in one view model. So that's going to sound vague. What do I actually mean by that? let's open up the view model class. So this is in package view model. And I have this object called list view model. And this thing essentially, well, it has as many states as I want. And I'm still kind of working on implementing this, but essentially it has these, it has a private constructor, and we create different sort of instances of this view model using these static kind of constructor methods, these static helper methods. And so I've got one called loading, I've got one called success, and I've got one called error. So just take note that this thing can be created with 3 different states at the moment. So we're going to kind of wrap this up by showing how our RxJava code and the operators are going to reactively kind of manage our user interface by use of these static view models. So what I'm going to show you is kind of the 3 different states. And I think if you see those, you'll kind of start to understand the magic that is RxJava. So let's get started here. We're going to bounce around a little, but let's go back to the presenter, back to these operators. And the first one we're going to talk about is start with. So when we initially set up this sort of, I want you to think of this whole thing and, where's this? And all this stuff that's in the repository data source, and even the stuff that's in the GitHub REST adapter here, all of this sort of thing, this is like a whole stream. It's like a stream of data with multiple different actors sort of publishing events and things like that. But I want you to think of it, it's like one whole thing that gets set up at runtime and it's just ready to go. And so what we do here, where I lost myself, list presenter. In list presenter, when this stream gets set up first, when it gets initialized, we have the start with operator. So what this says is when this whole observable stream starts, I want to emit this object. So I'm going to emit a listViewModel.loading object. And if we go to listViewModel.loading, what we see here is that it creates an object which doesn't have an error, is loading. We have a flag that it's loading. There's no error message, and there's no data. So this is one potential state. This is the state that we start our stream with. So when we start, oops, let's bring that over there. When we call this, almost before anything else happens, this list view model is going to get passed in here into this onNext. And then we're going to check for it. And we're going to say, oh, UI model is loading. And then we tell the view, show loading state. We do whatever we want to. We tell the view, you need to have the state loading, essentially, which in this case is we just show a loading indicator. So that's the first potential state. The next potential state is when we actually do get a response from our GitHub REST adapter, a response of data. That's going to get passed in to our flat map, and if our flat map succeeds, then what's going to happen is it's going to say flowable.just listViewModel.success. So it's going to emit a success state. If I hop it back into listViewModel, what we see here is that this thing accepts the list, and then it says it initializes the view model with has error false, is loading false, error message null, but we have data. Once again, that's going to get emitted all the way. It's going to pop out on this end of the observable observer, subscriber, whatever. It's going to pop out here. We're going to see, oh, sorry, I keep screwing myself up here. It's going to pop up here. And then we're going to say view, set the adapter in the view, display the data. And then the last potential state, and then I'll shut up because we're at 8:30, is on error return. So what's going to happen here is whenever an error kind of pops up in our data stream, which pretty much for our purposes, if an error is going to happen, it's probably going to happen in the retrofit or OKHTTP implementation. I won't talk about that, but if I open up, like, for example, I have this OKHTTP interceptor, and so what it does is it intercepts responses and also requests as they're going in, and it just kind of checks if there's an error. If there's an error, it's going to throw an exception. Even though we can throw an error here and something that's almost unrelated, it's still going to get propagated to our data stream. It's still going to throw an error in our RxJava magic. Within the RxJava code, this is going to fire this method here, on error return. So for this operator, I'm basically saying when we have, I believe the technical term is a checked exception, a non-fatal exception, I want you to give me that exception. Give me the throwable. I'm going to sort of then transform that depending on what happens, and this is an incomplete implementation, but if an error occurs, fire this on error return operator, and then we're going to emit an error state. And we're just going to pass the message of the error state into this list view model. And again, for the last time, that's going to get emitted in our subscriber, and then we're going to show an error message and then start the main activity. So all of those different, what are we trying to do here? Why did I bother to do that? The thing is, and this is, if you want more information on this, you can also check out Dan Liu's blog. Quite commonly, what I've been told from people who are pretty damn good at RxJava is that when it comes to things which shouldn't really be considered like a major error, so for example, you lose network connectivity, or you punch in the wrong you type in the wrong username, those are the kinds of things that shouldn't necessarily be treated as like application breaking, let's tear down everything, tear down the observable stream, we're screwed kinds of errors. What is suggested is to handle those as sort of a normal part of the user interface. And one way to handle that is to have these view models, which can be created with specific states. And then we kind of just emit these view models based on different events in our observable stream. So that's kind of my lesson and discussion on RxJava operators and how this application code works. If you have any suggestions or criticisms or anything about how I've implemented things here, please do let me know. Yeah, I think I'm going to run a quick commercial break, and hopefully that was insightful for people. And like I say, for the first couple minutes, if you have questions about that stuff, then I'll prioritize those questions. But after that, we'll just get to regular Q&A. And let's do an ad. All right. So, if you've liked the show so far, please do me a favor and hit the like button down below. And let's get started here. I see we have a viewer who's particularly obsessive about my life and sexual orientation. And I'm sorry to say, buddy, unfortunately I'm not gay, but you seem to have a lot of homophobia going on, Akalesh, and what I would suggest is you need to kind of accept that part of yourself. Anyways, let's get started here. So Joshua is asking, do you have any plans on Kotlin tutorial? That is the next tutorial I'm making, is a Kotlin tutorial. So we can get started with that. I'm going to try and answer this. What's the difference between Map and Flatmap? All right, I'm going to try and answer this. I'm going to be honest, I'm familiarizing myself with RxJava operators, but what I'm going to do is let's pull up the RxJava 2 documentation, and we'll have a quick look. Just pulling up the docs here, one sec. And oh yeah, I forgot how enormous the RxJava 2 documentation is. Holy crap. Like the observable class in the RxJava 2, like it's just absolutely enormous. There's so much you can do with it. Okay, so that is map, and one moment. What I'm doing is I'm pulling up the documentation for both Flatmap and Map, and we're going to see if we can figure this out. I'm sure there's RxJava experts that could tell you right away what the difference is, but so I believe, you know, I think, Christ, Daryl would probably be able to tell you right away. Just one moment. Merging the results. Sorry, I'm just trying to find the Flatmap, single observable. Oh, okay. So I think like the main thing that about Flatmap is that we're sort of flattening the emissions into one particular observable, I believe, is the primary difference. I'll be honest, like I'm familiarizing myself with RxJava 2 operators because what these things actually do isn't always immediately evident unless you're quite used to working with them. But like, yeah, what I think the primary difference is just that it sort of flattens them. I don't know. I can't really answer that question for you super well, to be perfectly honest. I, of course, use Flatmap because, yeah. I don't know. I'll have to get back to you on that one. I can't answer that one. So the This question is, what's the difference between... sorry about that, Sohail. I can't really answer your question. The thing is, I'm trying to think of a use case where... I'm trying to think of, like, to give you an answer as to where you would use each of them, and to be honest, I can't really think of a quick answer on that, so just reading the documentation probably wouldn't be very helpful for you, so I do apologize about that. But what's the difference between observable and flowable? I can answer that one fairly simply. So an observable, oh sorry, I forgot to write down who asked that. So that was Ali Reza. So essentially what an observable is versus a flowable is a flowable is back pressure enabled, whereas an observable isn't. So, but it's kind of irritating because if you go kind of Googling about the difference between an observable and a flowable, or even just RxJava in general, you're going to get questions or answers from RxJava 1, from 2, and even I think RxJava 2 changed its API a little bit a couple of months ago, well, quite a few months ago. So essentially, the thing is, what is back pressure? So flowables are back pressure enabled, observables are not. So there's certain kinds of data streams which give input so quickly, emit so many items, that you kind of need to be prepared to handle this enormous amount of emissions at once, and you kind of need to prepare it. So the documentation will kind of give you an idea of when you should use either, but to be perfectly honest, like the short answer is the difference is a flowable is back pressure enabled, an observable isn't. But as far as the use cases for when you need to be concerned about back pressure, there's different opinions on this. For example, like Kaushik Gopal from Fragmented Podcast, he wrote a couple of blogs, and he basically recommend that almost all of the time you can basically just use flowable. I'll generally speaking just use flowable. Again, that's the difficult thing, like with RxJava, the difficulty in understanding it is you need to know the specific use cases. You need to know, like, okay, I can understand what back pressure is, and I can understand what it isn't, like that kind of thing. But what I feel a lot of people don't talk about is the specific cases, like when do you want to use this? When do you want to use that? And there's lots of arguments about that. But anyways, that's the sort of the gist of it. You should check out Kaushik Gopal's articles on RxJava, because they do kind of illuminate things a little bit. Oh, okay. So thankfully, let's see here. Interesting. So just one point from my friend Darrell is mentioning that on the Flatmap versus map discussion, so what I'm gathering from his comment is that Flatmap allows you to change the actual stream type. So he mentions it, I'll just read what he says. So let's say you have a type user and you want to change it to admin user. So we've got two types of objects and we want to transform them in the operator. Then you would use map, but let's say you have a stream of type single, so you're returning a signal and you want to change the stream type, you would use Flatmap is what Devail is saying there. Oh, you didn't? Alizara, are you kind of clear on back pressure at this point? Like, it, if I could maybe give you an, okay, so why do we need back pressure? Let's say my GitHub REST adapter was, let's kind of rate, actually, let me do a better job of trying to teach this. So I'll give you some notes. And so first off, what's the difference? So Flowable has back pressure. We've already covered that, but I'm just going to make a note here. Support. Observable doesn't. And I think, do I have some, I should have code which. No, I guess retrofit handles that. Never mind. Okay, so back pressure. So let's say let's say case one. So POS Trainer. So this is a an application I've written. POS Trainer. So POS Trainer data streams come from system services like Alarm Manager. There's no reason to assume that my Alarm Manager service would be emitting hundreds of items at once. Case two, let's say a REST API. So, for example, if we go to, so the thing about GitHub is when I make my retrofit call to GitHub's server, GitHub is sort of set up that it already kind of, their API is so awesome that they only return a list of 30 repositories. So we don't have to worry so much about back pressure in the case of GitHub's API. But I want you to think, hopefully you're clear on what a REST API is. If you're not, what I really want you to think about of a REST API is just it's a database on the internet that you're going to be talking to. We don't need to get into the REST stuff even. In certain cases, if you have a database which emits a very large number of items or events, or emissions is the proper word, an RxJava emission, your code needs to be prepared to handle an overflow of these events. So how this essentially works is when you create a flowable, you have to specify a back pressure strategy. Let me see if I can pull up the documentation real quickly here for Flowable, RxJava 2 Flowable. And where is the constructor? Flowable, A and B, just. Back pressure. Okay, so for example, if we look at the Flowable's create method, you can specify this thing called a back pressure strategy. And I'm whoa, what just happened? My browser just like shit itself. All right, so we're gonna click on this back pressure strategy. Okay, so here's the important part here. So when you're building a flowable, you can specify a back pressure strategy. It should default to one of them. So what I want you to imagine is, let's say we're talking to some data source and it's firing like 1,000 or more emissions in quick succession. So we have our little phone, our little app here, and it's getting like data, like thousands of bits of data or whatever. Not bits, that's not a large amount, but thousands of chunks of data at once, thousands of emissions. In that particular case, we need to tell our code, how do we handle that? So there's different ways you can handle enormous emissions with back pressure strategies, and they're listed here. I don't need to read them all out per se, but so if we get like way too many emissions and we can't handle it, just drop the, as it say, drops the most recent on-next value. There's just different ways we can handle sort of enormous data streams. For an observable, you basically, what the general consensus is, if you have a data source and you know it's not going to be emitting an enormous number of emissions, I should say, then you can use an observable, single, that kind of stuff. If you have a data source which could potentially emit an enormous number of emissions in short succession or at once, then you would want to use a flowable. Another case is, a common case is, let's say you're doing like a finger painting app, so you want to like register drawing a line with your finger across the screen. That's going to generate like an insane number of emissions, because each time your finger moves like a 1/100th of a millimeter, it's going to fire an emission. And so that would be another example. So that's the idea with back pressure, is it's basically you're trying to handle enormous data streams. Now, that's all fine and dandy, but you'll find opinions like Kaushik basically says you should almost always use flowable and different things like that. So that's one of the things that's a little harder to nail down, but hopefully that makes sense what flowable is and kind of does. Luckily we've got Darrell here. He's the one who really knows about RxJava stuff better than I do. But hey, I'm able, like, I know my own code and use cases, so I can at least talk people through that. But as far as like remembering what exactly, I need to write a lot more samples before I could tell you off the top of my head what the different operators do, unfortunately. So what else have we got? Flatmap, concat map. I've got asked what I thought of React Native, which, if I'm not mistaken, is a JavaScript library. I'm not a JavaScript developer. Oh, I'm just going to run a quick commercial break. Wait for some questions. Awesome. So, all right. So I'm going to wait like a couple minutes for another question, any more questions, and then I'm going to call it a day. Yeah, I'm excited. So next week I'm going to be working on the retrofit tutorial, and I'll get that filmed and released. And then after that, I'm super excited because this Android REST tutorial that I'm writing right now is basically probably going to be the last Java project that I work on for quite a while. I'm going to be doing a couple of different Let's Build an App tutorials using Kotlin. So I'm super excited for that, and that's what I'll be starting on as soon as I'm finished recording the REST tutorial. And yeah, so super excited to get into that. The first thing I'll be building is I'm going to build I kind of have this opinion that if you can't build sort of a smaller scale, what I want to do is I want to build an application which leverages, of course, Kotlin, RxJava 2, clean architecture, use cases, all that crap, but it's just going to be a calculator. And so the purpose of it is, okay, I want to become really comfortable with Kotlin, so I'm going to build a small app really, really well, and then I'll build a larger app using all the things that I learned from building the smaller and less complicated project. Because one of the things I found out is that whenever you're sort of endeavoring to, say, learn RxJava 2 or Dagger 2 or something like Kotlin, an entirely new language, one way to approach it is to sort of build projects in isolation so that instead of kind of worrying about the general issues that will pop up when designing and building any sort of normal functional project, you just focus on the implementation with the simple project. So for example, a calculator, there's nothing really complicated going on as far as the problem domain is concerned. So then you just focus on building like a really flexible architecture, and I'm excited to do it. But yeah, and we're gonna have, I was actually talking to mon ami Darrell, who's been giving tons of input in the chat, and merci. I was talking to him about having a look at his repository, because he's done this insane level of single responsibility and separation of concerns and encapsulation in one of his repositories. So I'm super excited. We're going to be doing a collaboration on that. And so far the plan is I'm basically just going to ask him about it and interview and do all that stuff. But before I get to his code, which is, of course, is in Kotlin, I'm going to have to brush up my own Kotlin skills. Although I've written Kotlin code. I'm not a complete noob in it. It's just, I've never built a full app with Kotlin, so that's a milestone that I kind of need to reach before I start teaching people about it, of course. Anyways, I'm just going to check the chat here and let's see, is there any other questions? I have not. Hey, what's up, Tina? Yeah, here's the thing. Maybe that's, I think I'll probably close on this. So if you had asked me 6 months ago about Kotlin, my response to it was basically, yeah, I do think you should learn it, but at the same time, I think if you're a beginner, you should learn Java first. You should learn the basics of Java and then go to Kotlin. And the rationale I gave at that point was that, unfortunately, I'm sure there's plenty, at the time, sort of what I would have said is that I know there's plenty of samples in learning Kotlin, but as far as the complicated things in Android, like RxJava and retrofit and all that kind of stuff, there wasn't so many samples that were written in Kotlin for that kind of stuff. So of course, I didn't say expressly, whatever, 6 or 8 months ago that what I basically said is this Kotlin will catch up to Java. What I would say at this point is that that transition, I do believe, has occurred quicker, to the extent that, and here's the thing, when you're used to writing in Java and you start writing things in Kotlin, you'll see pretty quickly how much time and convenience and power, all these different things which Kotlin just really helps you out with. So, which is why basically after this this Android Rust tutorial, most of my code that I write on this channel will be in Kotlin, because at this point, I feel like I have more than enough Java samples. So if people want to learn how to build an app writing it in Java, I've got code where I can, I've got that covered. And I, of course, want to dive into Kotlin as well, so I'm super excited for that. Anyways, it's 9 o'clock, we're an hour in here. Yeah, hopefully the RxJava 2 sort of application flow lesson was a little bit interesting to people. Obviously, like I say, I'm still working on improving it myself, and I'm wrapping my head around RxJava operators as well. But yeah, hey, it's, you know, I never claimed to be the expert. Certainly, my biggest expertise is in software architecture. But hey, it's all part of a process of learning. So thank you so much for watching. Hopefully that was insightful. We'll be live for another episode next Sunday, and I will be working on the Android REST tutorial this week. So that's going to be finished up soon. The repository is public. If you would like to have a look at it and potentially suggest changes and potentially get a shout out in the tutorial video itself, go have a look at my Android REST tutorial code. See if there's anything in the RxJava 2, in the Dagger 2, in the retrofit that you think might be a good addition, bearing in mind that I'm not changing the use case of the application. So if you want to suggest something about the user interface, I'm not really concerned about that. It's an introduction to REST and using RxJava to communicate with your REST adapter. So that's the primary content of the tutorial. And so yeah, if you have any suggestions for that, head on over, click on the repository, and pop up, create an issue or something like that in GitHub. Thanks a lot for watching, and peace out.